Who made the stupidest and most embarrassing mistake in history? During the Spanish-American War, the US decided to take Guam, so they showed up with a bunch of gunships and fired a warning shot to say this is your last chance to surrender peacefully. There was no response. Then, a small Spanish ship started rowing up to the American fleet, and when they got there, a representative said, "Hi. Welcome to Guam. We saw that you fired your guns to salute us, and we would have saluted you back, but unfortunately we ran out of gunpowder and nobody has been by to restock us." Nobody told Guam that the US and Spain were at war. When the Americans informed the representative that they were at war and were there to conquer this island, they asked again if Guam would like to surrender. The representative, having already given away that they had no gunpowder, agreed to surrender. Edit: thank you guys all so much for the likes. It really brightened my day. Smile? Hygeilochus. He was an actor performing the play Orestes by the famous playwright Euripides. In the dramatic climax, the king he was playing lay dying and is supposed to say, "After the storm I see again a calm sea," as he expires. He mispronounced the word Galen as Galen, changing the line to "After the storm I see again a weasel." This embarrassing mistake happened in 408 BC. It is the only thing we know about Hygeilochus. It was so humiliating and so widely mocked that we're still talking about it 2,431 years later. Whoever lost Special Order 191. In 1862, during the American Civil War, Robert E. Lee decides to invade the Union. His outnumbered army is secretly marching in several divided columns into Maryland to attack Washington, D.C. He sends out this secret order to his top commanders, detailing where and when everyone should be during the march. A few days later, a Union soldier finds a couple of cigars lying in a field, with a copy of these orders wrapped around them. Some idiot had dropped it. The item gets passed up the chain of command to Union General McClellan himself, who proudly proclaims, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." McClellan does next to nothing until the Battle of Antietam, where he and his 75,000 men do not whip Lee and his 38,000. In fact, a third of them receive no orders from McClellan at all. The battle ends in a draw, and Lee escapes back to the south. McClellan does go home, though, because Lincoln fires him. The guys that accidentally brought down the Berlin Wall by declaring at a press conference that the right of freedom to travel was effective immediately, which was not at all what the GDR's political party had wanted, which led to thousands of people rushing to and overwhelming the borders and in the end to the reunification of Germany. It was a small mistake, but with a great outcome. I've scrolled for a while and haven't seen anything about Mao Zedong ordering an eradication of sparrows from China in 1959. Sparrows were believed to be pests that ate grain, so the authorities started a campaign to eradicate them, along with some other perceived pests. The eradication worked. Unfortunately, the sparrows, while they do eat some grain, also play a critical role in controlling the insect pests that cause crop disasters of a biblical scale. The next year, locusts boomed without their sparrow predator and took the crops, initiating a famine that killed 15 million people. China ended up having to import sparrows from the Soviet Union. Franz Ferdinand's lead driver that took a wrong turn on the way to the hospital to see victims of the original assassination attempt on the Archduke. They inadvertently brought Ferdinand directly to his assassin, leading to, well, the 20th and 21st centuries of war and death. The captain of U-1206. During World War II, it was fitted with a high-pressure toilet system that was so complex flushing it required a trained technician to do it. So one day it was out on war patrol when the captain needs to use it. Unfortunately, the number 2 he pinched off was of considerable stench, so out of embarrassment, he attempts to operate the flushing mechanism himself. Unfortunately, he botches up the sequence of valves needed to successfully operate it, and ends up causing water to leak onto the batteries used to power the ship whilst underwater, which causes the ship to begin to fill up with cyanide gas, and as a result they have to surface to recirculate the air out. To add insult to injury, this all takes place off the coast of Scotland and are promptly spotted by RAF Coastal Command, who then proceed to send a welcoming committee, and the captain is forced to order the ship. Scuttled? 4 crewmen die, the rest captured. All as a result of the captain not wanting to admit he did a stinky poo. Thomas Midgley Jr. made 2 of the biggest. He was one of the early pioneers of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, compounds that became widely used in industry, and which were destroying the ozone layer. He also invented leaded gasoline and insisted that it was safe to use. To proudly never do. Figma just sold for like 20 billions or something for a program that is like 5 years old. It might be the biggest fumble by a software company that was for all intents monopoly in its space that I've ever seen, and it's completely deserved. This is nowhere near as big as the rest, but it's pretty recent. During the last decade, web design went from being done on Photoshop to the whole industry doing it on this hot new software called Sketch. It was leaps and bounds better as a web design tool, and within like 2 years of it being out, any web/UI/UX designer had to be using it. The problem is that Sketch was only a Mac program. While in the West this might not be a problem, in huge parts of the world getting a Mac is prohibitively expensive, there's no Apple stores, and importing one might double its price. Many people assumed a Windows version would be coming soon after, but the team at Sketch refused to work on a Windows version despite the obvious market for it. It made it so every designer basically had to have a Mac, and around where I am it meant that you'd have a Mac at work but a Windows PC at home and couldn't work in Sketch. Sketch was basically the entire UX design industry for a while. I specifically remember the CEO of Sketch proudly saying during an interview that there will never ever be a Windows version. Well, a few years later a competitor came out that skipped the Windows versus Mac debate by starting with a browser app, meaning you could use it on any system. It was also a free app where Sketch was paid on top of needing a Mac. It was crazy to watch in real time how badly Sketch fell off. In the case of everyone I know, the literal next project after you found out about Figma was done in Figma and not Sketch, and you'd only go back to Sketch to work on old projects you did in Sketch. Now it's Figma only, a product that was basically a bad copy of Sketch with zero innovation except for the fact it was made to include people outside of the Mac ecosystem, which is something Sketch could do but chose. Those responsible for the loss of a mission to Mars in the mid-90s because a team didn't know it was supposed to be working in metric measurements. So the spaceship, all of its money, all of the planning, all of the anticipated data, poof, gone because of a stupid mistake that should have been caught by a process. Devastated the entire empire, at one point murdering everyone they could catch and burning whole cities to the ground. They also just kept on expanding, under Genghis and his successors, until finally turning back after ravaging Hungary. Obviously there is no counterfactual. We can't know what would have happened had the emperor actually offered the compensation and punished the offending governor. Maybe the Mongols would have invaded anyway. However, at the time the Mongols were busy attacking the Jin in China, so it wasn't by any means obvious. On its face, It looks like the decision to murder the ambassador instead was about the worst in history. It led directly to the destruction of his own empire, his death, and the wider devastation caused by the Mongols in Europe and the Middle East. In the early 13th century, the Emperor of Khwarezmia and the Khan of the Mongols were at peace. They had, in fact, cooperated in defeating other Central Asian enemies. However, relations between them cooled. The Mongols sent a rich caravan through the territory of one of the governors of the other state. The governor seized the caravan for himself, and had the Mongols accompanying it murdered. In response, the Mongols sent ambassadors to the other emperor, demanding compensation and that the governor be punished. For whatever reason, the emperor decided instead to cut off the head of one of the ambassadors, and send it back to the Mongols, carried by the others. This was, to put it mildly, a mistake. To the Mongols, ambassadors were sacred, and harming one a horrible offense. The Mongols mobilized their army, and defeated the emperor comprehensively. Worse, they absolutely. During the Revolutionary War in the US, I think that's the proper war's name, a spy scouted and saw George Washington crossing the Delaware River. He tried bringing the report to his commanding officer, who waved him off because he was in the middle of a poker game. Said commanding officer was found dead the next day with the report still in his coat pocket. I thought Alaska was a loss-making colony for Russia that they had no hope of successfully defending if the UK, who had just defeated them in the Crimean War, or the US in their full manifest destiny mode, had decided to take it by force. By that logic they did well to at least get some money for it. American diplomat Paul Bremer is put in charge of governing Iraq in May 2003 after US forces took over Baghdad. Without seeking input from Washington, as his first act he issues 2 edicts with disastrous long-term consequences. Coalition Provisional Authority Order No. 1, members of the Ba'ath Party are banned from working in government. Note that, Iraq having been a one-party dictatorship, this is basically everyone in government. Coalition Provisional Authority Order No. 2, the entire Iraqi military, national police force, legislature, and court system, and also the Ministry of Education and Olympic Committee just for shits and giggles I guess, are disbanded. Immediately, period, end of sentence. If you were one of the 350,000 Iraqi soldiers or one of the thousands of people with jobs in those other government entities, you're fired. Here's where this one was a major fuck-up. Many Iraqi soldiers, who, crucially, had their military-issued acts at home with them, did not join the fight. Many officers did not mobilize their units to resist the American invasion at all, and many of those who did surrendered on contact. But it didn't matter if you were a private who stayed home or a general who surrendered with no resistance, you're jobless. Some of these generals became leaders of sectarian militias, and many of their now unemployed soldiers became their fighters. CPA Order 2 dismantled the government and military. CPA Order 1 made it so that they had to be reassembled mostly with exiles and or people with no experience. Which meant a government that was unpopular and ineffectual from the start. There is a direct line between this decision, and the rise of Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Robert A. Kehoe killed millions and reduced the average IQ by nearly 3-4, wrongly, proclaiming lead safe to use in paints, cars, etc. This wasn't a mistake though, the risks of lead were very well known at the time. When researching fuel additives that would make engines run better, they discovered that both lead and ethanol worked well. However, only lead could be patented to make them a huge profit. Low stakes, but high embarrassment. Four Seasons Lawn Services. I dunno, it so flawlessly encapsulates everything you need to know about the Trump administration that it's kind of perfect as it is. Somebody, sometime is going to write a book that includes the background of how this happened, and the world will laugh in harmony once again for that perfect moment of absurdity. I saw that press conference live, and I still have problems believing my subconscious didn't make it up, though my subconscious isn't nearly as talented at parody and satire for that. Hitler invading Russia. Hindsight is a hell of a thing. You have to remember how abysmally Russia fought against the Finns and the severe defeats Germany inflicted in 1941 against Russia. My understanding was the Germans anticipated a relatively quick victory against Russia, and then having time to grab resources for use against the anticipated war with America. The sheer level of destruction the Russians/Soviets were able to endure shocked and surprised everyone. No one thought it possible to lose 10 million men and 10,000 plus tanks and vehicles and still keep fighting. And that the Russians did. In all seriousness, I think the stupidest and most embarrassing mistake in history is one that wasn't made, but came very close to taking place. Most people know something about the Challenger disaster, the space shuttle that blew up during launch because the bureaucratic higher-ups had ignored critical warnings given by the engineers. Most people know that, because of the school teacher in space program putting a teacher on that shuttle, the launch was being watched live by countless young children across the nation. What many people do not know, though, is that they nearly put Carol Spinney, a puppeteer, on board in full costume as part of the program. Spinney was at the time the actor who portrayed the character of Big Bird from Sesame Street. So NASA came this close to not only killing an entire crew of astronauts in front of millions of children, but also killing Big Bird in the process. That would have made the whole JFK debacle look like spilling milk. He also invented radio before Marconi did, but wanted to use it to transmit power wirelessly, and Marconi beat him to it because Tesla did not understand what he created. He did have his pigeons though. I loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and she loved me. As long as I had her, there was a purpose to my life. Short-sightedness. It was British propaganda as well as confusion over the French and imperial inch. British cartoonists of the time like James Gillray depicted him as short, which became the prevailing image of Napoleon in popular culture. Napoleon was measured as 5 feet 2 inches in French inches, now no longer in use, which is around 5 feet 6 inches - 5 feet 7 inches in imperial, 1.67 to 1.70 meters. Not exactly a towering colossus, but still taller than the average Frenchman at the time. To be fair, Napoleon didn't exactly help his cause by surrounding himself with the old guard, who were required to be much taller than average. The leaders of Europe in the years leading up to World War I. Every pre-World War I leader on both sides, why would I put any effort into trying basic diplomacy to resolve a conflict in a Central European backwater possession of a middling country? I can just greatly exaggerate the problem and start a war that clearly we'll win in a couple of months. The War of the Triple Alliance, or, that time Paraguay tried to conquer all of South America. Saddam Hussein launching an invasion of Kuwait thinking it wouldn't lead to US retaliation. The Japanese doing Pearl Harbor thinking they could win a war against the US or at least scare them out of entering the war. The communist world ideologically rejecting genetic science in favor of Lysenkoism. In 1876 Alexander Bell, desperate for money, offered to sell his telephone invention to Western Union after proving that the device could work over their existing telegraph lines. The price was $100,000. Western Union declined, saying the telephone was just a toy and would never amount to anything. May would have taken a lot of time and a lot of money. Also, the Napoleonic Wars were mostly fought on land. Better ships probably wouldn't have made that big of a difference. He also rejected the idea of breech-loading rifles. But it didn't matter anyway because he was presented with them, I think, in early 1812. The army wouldn't have been equipped with them anyway before his defeat. The Great Emu War. The Australian military lost a war to a bunch of emus. This one really shits me because they still managed to wipe out about 50,000 emus because a couple of farmers went, "Why, I don't know how to build fences to stop big birds from eating my crops." Frowns. It was a disgusting act against nature, but everyone treats it like a big joke because we gave it a funny name. Chernobyl was pretty bad. That was a series of awful decisions, not just one though. I agree. It wasn't just a lapse of judgment. It was layers of errors. Not to mention people in charge, not experts, trying to cover up the incident, to not cause a panic. It's a fucking nuclear reactor. Shut it down, contain the problem, and get people away while they still have the opportunity to not breathe in radioactive dust particles. My personal favorite is New Zealand Prime Minister Robert Muldoon getting drunk in his office one night and then calling a snap election. 2 weeks later, his government was voted out of office. Theresa May did something similar in the UK. Called a surprise election the week after saying there wouldn't be one, refused to turn up to the TV debate all the other leaders went to, then lost her majority and had to pay a bunch of Northern Irish fundamentalist Christians £1 billion to buy their votes in Parliament. And she still wasn't the most disastrous PM we've had in the last 5 years. In fact, probably coming a comfortable third. Napoleon going to Russia with somewhere around 500k troops and returning with roughly 10k. The saying goes, never invade Russia in winter. But the worst of their losses happened in July and quite a few were from disease and heat exhaustion. Water supplies ran low in the July heat wave. Dying of heat exhaustion in Russia of all places. Surely there must be an argument for Chairman Mao and the Great Leap Forward of 1958 to 1962. Specifically, the drastic culling of grain-eating sparrows. It transpired that while sparrows eat a little grain, they were also great for keeping the locust population down, and locusts eat a lot of grain. The Great Sparrow Genocide was followed by a locust, devastated harvest and huge famine. Given to the Mongol soldiers as slaves, and the rest of the population was massacred. The Persian scholar Juvayni states that 50,000 Mongol soldiers were given the task of executing 24 citizens each, which would mean that 1.2 million people were killed. After which the Mongols broke some nearby dams and flooded the ruins of the city to complete its destruction. The Mongol reluctance to take any prisoners made this one of the bloodiest wars in human history, with total casualties estimated to be between 2 and 15 million people. Sultan Muhammad fled west with some of his most loyal soldiers to a small island in the Caspian Sea. It was there, in December 1220, that the Shah died, reportedly of fright and anxiety about what the Mongols were going to do to him. https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/mongol_of_the_Khwarezmian_Empire. Inalhuk, who was to be taken alive? These orders were carried out to the letter, and upon the fall of the city of Uttara and the massacre of its inhabitants, Inalhuk was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes, mouth, and ears. The Mongols then went on to capture and destroy the cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Gurganj. Genghis and his youngest son Tolui then laid waste to the cities of Herat, Nishapur, and Merv, three of the largest cities in the world at the time. At Merv, after a week-long siege, the city's governor surrendered the city after the Mongols promised that the lives of the citizens would be spared. As soon as the city was handed over, however, Tolui slaughtered almost every person who surrendered. After capturing the city of Gurganj, standard Mongol policy was followed. Any captured artisans were sent back to Mongolia, young women and children were. In 1218 a trading caravan from a far-away place called Mongolia arrived at the Khwarezmian city of Uttara, on the edge of the Khwarezmian Empire. Inalhuk, the governor of the city, accused the traders of being spies, stole all their stuff, and killed all of them, about 450 people. The king of the Mongols, a guy named Genghis Khan, heard about this, and was incredibly upset. He sent an allegation of one Muslim and two Mongol diplomats to Sultan Muhammad, the Sultan of the entire Khwarezmian Empire, demanding Inalhuk be punished. Sultan Muhammad decided to back up his governor, and in a move calculated to intimidate the Mongols, beheaded the Muslim ambassador and humiliated the two Mongol ambassadors by shaving off their beards. Genghis Khan was, strangely enough, not intimidated at all. He decided to invade Khwarezm. The Mongols had orders to kill everyone in Uttara except for France, spending the equivalent of $20 billion on new trains that were too wide to fit through tunnels in the country was a pretty dumb mistake. Edit, I'm wrong. It was Spain spending the equivalent of $276 million for trains too wide for their tunnels. And if I am not mistaken, South Africa in recent years bought some trains from France which did not fit on their SAs, tracks, being too narrow or slightly too wide, I can't recall which. But then again, my country is well known for its embarrassing gaffes and blunders already, so. Four Seasons Landscaping Giuliani. What exactly happened here? He called a press conference at a place he thought was the Four Seasons Hotel. On November 7, 2020, 4 days after the United States presidential election, Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York City and an attorney for then-President Donald Trump, hosted a press conference at Four Seasons Total Landscaping, a small business in the Holmesburg neighborhood of near northeast Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The event was held at the company's garage door and parking lot to discuss the status of the Trump campaign. The site of the press conference, a local landscaping business, was unexpected. Many journalists and others quickly observed a comical aspect to its location, near a sex shop and a crematorium. This site selection led to speculation that the Trump campaign meant to book the upscale Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia, 5 city blocks from the Pennsylvania Convention Center, where Philadelphia's ballots were being counted. Edit, source, Wikipedia. I've heard they did that to switch original Coke to corn syrup sweetener and figured they'd take a loss either way, but more free marketing with new Coke failure while they worked out kinks with corn syrup. Urban legend. Quite likely. Had uncle who was NY-ed man back in the day who said that's what he had heard. Of course he also told some other tall tales. Probably the guy who lied and said vaccines cause autism. Not only did he give false hope to parents of kids with autism, he's indirectly responsible for millions of lives lost with people dying from diseases they could have been vaccinated against. And is also responsible for many people who overwhelmed hospitals during COVID, because they didn't get vaccinated and had to seek treatment when they caught it. Even though his research findings were retracted, many still believe what he said. Andrew Wakefield is the guy's name. Columbus discovering America thinking it was India, and because of that giving the name Indians to Native Americans. Francisco Hernández de Córdoba found the Yucatan Peninsula and brought a local onto the ship and asked where they were. The indigenous individual said in his language, "I'm sorry, I don't understand you," or something similar, which translates to Yucatan. But Jacques Cartier sailing up the St. Lawrence did the same thing, asking two indigenous kids something similar, and they said Canada was that way. He thought it was the land, and they just meant a village, becoming Canada.